I lay paralyzed in my sprawling Star Island mansion in Miami during Category 3 Hurricane Clara, watching my husband Brandon coldly execute a plan to murder me. While sustained 120-mile-an-hour winds battered the estate, Brandon gathered my specialized cardiac medication, shut off our power, and locked me inside to die alone so he could claim my $40 million yachting logistics empire. He then casually boarded the last outward flight on his private jet just hours before the airport grounded all aviation for the storm, heading out with his mother and sister for a 60-day luxury Mediterranean cruise, convinced my demise would look like a natural medical failure before they returned. But greed makes monsters foolishly careless. If you want to see how true justice strikes back when greedy parasites step into a trap, click like and subscribe now to follow Chapter 2. The storm raged against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my master bedroom on Star Island, Florida. Thunder rattled the frame of my bed as I struggled to breathe, my chest tight from my failing heart. I was 30 years old, the sole founder and owner of the region's largest maritime logistics fleet, yet I was entirely at the mercy of the man I had married. Brandon stepped into the bedroom, smoothing the lapels of his $1,800 Italian wool suit. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed sickeningly with the humid dampness entering through the balcony seals. Outside the hallway door, his mother Patricia's voice echoed loudly, boasting about the $12,000 diamond earrings she intended to purchase during their upcoming stop in Monaco. Behind her, my sister-in-law Ashley whined about how my chronic illness made me a depressing burden that constantly dragged down the family's social standing at the yacht club. I reached weakly toward the vanity, whispering for help. My body was burning with fever, and my heartbeat fluttered erratically. I asked Brandon to hand me the vial of custom heart failure medication sitting on the glass tray, a specialized prescription costing $18,000 per vial that maintained my fragile cardiac rhythm. Instead of helping, Brandon picked up my primary emergency dose along with the backup vials from the tray, turned them in his fingers with a look of utter disgust, and walked out onto the private balcony. Before my eyes, he casually tossed the entire glass tray over the railing into the churning storm drain 3 stories below. When he returned, his eyes were cold and vacant. He leaned down and whispered into my ear that my incurable condition was an unnecessary expense and that everyone would be better off once I was gone. He picked up my smartphone and laptop from the nightstand, tucking them firmly under his arm to cut off any communication. In that agonizing moment, a terrifying psychological truth crystallized in my mind. For years, I had fallen into the subtle trap of normalized cruelty. When a family slowly shifts from subtle disrespect to emotional neglect, your mind gradually rationalizes their behavior to survive. You tell yourself they are stressed, or clumsy, or simply insensitive. This psychological conditioning creates an invisible chain of obedience, making you accept step-by-step abuse as ordinary domestic life until a life-or-death crisis finally shatters the dangerous illusion. Sitting in the dark, I realized Brandon had never loved me. He had merely been waiting for my health to degrade enough to steal what I built. Brandon walked to the hallway panel, flipped the main breaker switches to kill the backup generator, and engaged the master security override. With a cold smirk, he activated the digital deadbolt and enabled the manual interior lockout, completely disabling the emergency thumb turn from inside. As the electronic keypad beeped, I heard him reset the access code to 8888, locking me in absolute containment. The room plunged into pitch-black darkness as rain began leaking under the terrace doors. My strength was fading, but my survival instinct roared to life. I refused to let these parasites inherit my life's work. Dragging my heavy, trembling body off the mattress, I collapsed onto the floor. I began crawling 12 feet across the freezing Carrara marble, every inch feeling like glass slicing through my muscles. Gasping for air in the damp dark, my fingers blindly searched the baseboard beneath the heavy mahogany bookcase until I located the low hidden panel. Pushing it open, my cold hand gripped the rubberized casing of my dual-frequency satellite transceiver. I pressed the flashing red SOS trigger on the satellite transceiver, transmitting my encrypted GPS coordinates directly to my father Charles's maritime security fleet docked in Biscayne Bay. Even in the dead of night, with Category 3 winds tearing through the coastal palm trees, I knew my emergency distress signal would override every civilian communication channel. My father was an international shipping magnate, a man who had built a global maritime empire through sheer discipline and foresight. While I had spent years attempting to forge an independent path with my own yachting logistics enterprise, Charles had always maintained a quiet, invisible umbrella of protection over my life. Within 40 minutes, the heavy storm shutters protecting the master suite windows shattered under the relentless force of hydraulic cutters. The blinding glare of tactical flashlights banished the suffocating dark as Dominic, my father's chief of security, breached the room with his 4-man tactical squad. They moved with military precision, clearing the perimeter before calling in the onboard paramedics. Lying cold on the damp Carrara marble, I felt the sharp prick of an intravenous line as the medical team injected cardiac stimulants directly into my bloodstream, stabilizing my fluttering pulse before wrapping me in thermal blankets and loading me into an armored medical transport. An hour later, I woke up under the sterile fluorescent lights of Intensive Care Unit Room 402 at Mount Sinai Medical Center. My mother Elizabeth sat beside my bed, clutching my trembling hand, her face wet with silent tears. Standing by the window overlooking the rain-swept bay, my father Charles spoke into a secure phone, his voice vibrating with absolute icy authority. He was not merely a worried parent. He was a titan of industry whose line had been crossed. My father's restraint in past years had never been a sign of weakness or detachment. He had stayed in the background purely out of deep respect for my independence, allowing me to build my enterprise, marry the man I chose, and run my life on my own terms. But the moment that sacred boundaries was violated by malicious intent, his gentle restraint vanished, replaced by an absolute, unyielding force that would stop at nothing to protect his child. Charles turned to his lead forensic accountant, standing in the corner, and issued a series of sharp, decisive commands. He ordered an immediate, comprehensive audit of every transaction authorized by Brandon over the past 2 years, simultaneously revoking his signatory authority across all 14 corporate subsidiary accounts tied to my parent company. On the 10th day of my intensive rehabilitation, as the color finally returned to my face and my cardiac rhythm stabilized, my lead legal counsel Marcus entered room 402 carrying a thick leather binder. He opened the file to reveal a mountain of recent bank statements. While I was lying flatlined in the ICU fighting for every breath, Brandon had been living like royalty in Saint-Tropez. Using supplementary corporate credit cards issued under my company's primary account, he had blown through $85,000 in less than a week on luxury suites, fine dining, and private yacht charters. To make matters worse, Marcus pulled up a trending video on his tablet. It was a live broadcast posted by my mother-in-law, Patricia, from a $3,500 a night luxury resort in Capri. Sipping champagne against the backdrop of the Mediterranean, Patricia wiped away fake tears for her social media followers, solemnly announcing that her beloved daughter-in-law had passed away quietly at home after a long, brave medical battle. She went on to ask for privacy as the family grieved during their private memorial voyage. The sheer sociopathy of their actions was astounding. They were actively broadcasting my death to the world to justify their lavish spending and set the stage for probate fraud. Marcus explained that without a formal death certificate, their social media announcements were nothing more than fraudulent staging. He was ready to issue immediate public denials and freeze every corporate line. However, leaving those credit lines open was a calculated legal trap, a deliberate strategy to allow Brandon to rack up felony-level charges of wire fraud and grand larceny across international borders. Marcus looked at me, offering to freeze every single credit card immediately and issue international arrest warrants to leave them stranded on the streets of Europe without a single euro. I looked at the credit statements, then at my father, and finally at Marcus. A cold, calculating calm settled over my chest. I raised my hand and shook my head. I instructed Marcus to leave all current line limits active. I wanted Brandon, Patricia, and Ashley to feel completely unbothered, to fly as high as their boundless greed would carry them for the entire 60-day duration of their vacation. Every dinner, every designer handbag, every fraudulent charge on foreign soil would become another ironclad piece of evidence in a paper trail that would destroy them completely. I was no longer the fragile wife suffering in silence. I was laying a trap from which none of them would ever escape. Over the course of 50 days in private rehabilitation, my body underwent a complete physical rebirth under the care of elite physical therapists and specialized clinical nutritionists. The debilitating weakness that had held me hostage during the storm began to recede. Every day, I pushed myself to walk longer distances through the clinic's private gardens, rebuilding my muscle tone and restoring my stamina. My skin regained its healthy glow. My breathing grew steady and deep, and the exhaustion that had once clouded my eyes was replaced by a sharp, unwavering focus. I was no longer a bedridden victim suffering in silence. I was a strategist preparing to reclaim everything that belonged to me. While I rebuilt my physical strength, my legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Marcus delivered a crucial revelation after conducting a forensic audit of my corporate structure. He discovered that my premarital trust retained 98% of the total shareholding in my yachting logistics company. Brandon held zero actual equity. He had been granted the title of Chief Executive Officer purely through a revocable proxy agreement I had drafted years ago to protect his delicate ego around his peers. Legally speaking, Brandon was nothing more than an appointed salaried employee who served entirely at my discretion. When an incompetent individual is handed unearned executive authority, they inevitably build a fragile delusion of superiority. They begin to believe that the title on their office door reflects their intrinsic power, completely forgetting that their status is merely a temporary illusion funded by someone else's capital and labor. This hollow arrogance makes them foolishly careless, convincing them they are untouchable right up until the moment the actual owner steps forward and reclaims financial control, shattering their empty power in a single instant. With a firm, deliberate stroke of my pen, I signed a formal board resolution revoking Brandon's appointment as Chief Executive Officer with immediate effect. Simultaneously, Marcus executed court orders freezing all joint bank accounts containing $420,000. The financial tap that had sustained his lavish lifestyle overseas was permanently closed. While the legal trap was being finalized, Dominic and his security team systematically overhauled the Star Island mansion. They completely removed the old smart lock system that Brandon had tampered with, replacing every access point with advanced biometric scanners, encrypted keypads, and high-definition digital surveillance cameras. The home where I had nearly lost my life was transformed into an impenetrable fortress under my direct command. During the physical walkthrough of the estate, I entered Brandon's private study. Resting in a sleek holder on his mahogany desk was an executive pen I had gifted him months prior, a customized instrument containing a hidden, continuous, dual-frequency audio recorder. Pushing the encrypted digital files to my tablet, Marcus and I listened to the crystal-clear playback. The recording captured Brandon speaking openly with his mother, detailing his cold-blooded plan to let my heart fail during the hurricane so he could seize control of my $40 million maritime enterprise. It was the definitive, irrefutable evidence that transformed a domestic dispute into a criminal prosecution. On the morning of the 60th day, the final phase of my return was ready. Standing before the mirror in my master suite, I selected an unblemished white power suit paired with sharp black heels and immaculate tailoring. The pristine white fabric symbolized my complete transformation from a silent victim into an absolute ruler, reclaiming her domain. There was no trace of vulnerability or hesitation left in my expression. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a hired black limousine pulled up to the front entrance of the Star Island mansion, unloading Brandon, Patricia, and Ashley, alongside 12 heavy designer suitcases. Brandon swaggered up the front steps, laughing loudly with his family about how they would immediately call a biohazard crew to purge the property of my memory. He reached for the digital lock and confidently punched in 8888. The keypad flashed bright red, emitting a harsh error buzz that cut off his laughter. Before he could punch the code again, the heavy front door swung wide open from the inside as Dominic stepped into the threshold. Brandon, Patricia, and Ashley froze in absolute terror as their eyes moved past Dominic into the sunlit living room. There, sitting in total serenity on the plush velvet sofa in an unblemished white power suit, was me, flanked by 4 towering armed security guards. Patricia stumbled backward, clutching her throat and screeching that I was an ungrateful ghost who had returned to ruin their rightful family estate. Ashley pushed past her mother, hysterically screaming that I had no right to be alive because Brandon had already promised her a $60,000 sports car from my estate settlement. Sociopathic entitlement blinds abusive people to reality. When individuals normalize their own cruelty, they convince themselves that their selfish desires grant them absolute immunity from the law and public judgment. They genuinely believe that their fraud, theft, and malicious acts are earned privileges, rendering them utterly incapable of anticipating the catastrophic consequences of their documented crimes until the trap slams shut. I stood up slowly, picking up a heavy leather binder from the glass table. I stepped forward and hurled the file directly at Brandon's chest, sending loose paper spreadsheets scattering across the entry floor. I announced that while I was fighting for my life in intensive care, Brandon had racked up $180,000 in fraudulent charges on corporate cards across Europe. Seeing the itemized bank statements and hearing my commanding voice, Brandon's face turned completely pale as he realized his empire of lies had collapsed. Without uttering another word, I nodded to Dominic. On my command, the 4 guards seized Brandon, Patricia, and Ashley by their arms, physically dragging them out of the mansion while they kicked and screamed. The guards dumped their scuffed suitcases onto the Star Island mansion driveway and slammed the double doors shut, permanently revoking their access. The following morning, Brandon tried to maintain his delusion of executive power by attempting to storm our Midtown Miami corporate headquarters. Clad in his Italian suit, he tried to force his way through the glass turnstiles, bellowing at the staff that he was still the chief executive officer. 2 broad-shouldered security guards stepped forward, physically blocking the turnstiles, while the human resources director handed him a small cardboard box containing his desk items and an official notice of immediate termination for cause. As Brandon stood humiliated in the lobby, my corporate public relations team executed a synchronized media strike. They released the crystal-clear audio recording from his desk pen alongside time-stamped expense timelines of their European spending directly to major Miami news outlets and digital platforms. Within hours, the story created an instant viral firestorm, exposing their sociopathic scheme to the entire world and destroying their reputation forever. The criminal trial at the Florida State Circuit Court moved with swift, unyielding finality. Sitting in the quiet courtroom, I listened as the state prosecutor presented the irrefutable digital evidence, the time-stamped audio recording from the desk pen, the surveillance footage, and the bank statements detailing their fraudulent overseas spending spree. Brandon sat at the defense table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his head bowed, stripped of every shred of arrogance. Standing at the bench, Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom before handing down the verdict. He declared that Brandon's actions demonstrated calculated malice and an absolute disregard for human life. Judge Morrison sentenced Brandon to 12 years at the Blackwater Correctional Facility for attempted murder and grand larceny, while ordering him to pay $350,000 in restitution directly to me. As the gavel struck the wooden block, Brandon collapsed back into his chair, realizing that his greed had purchased him a decade behind bars. While Brandon awaited transfer to state prison, Patricia and Ashley faced their own grim reckoning. Stripped of access to my financial accounts, they had been evicted from their temporary accommodation after failing to pay their bill. With only $42 in cash remaining between them, they were forced to take shelter inside a rusted 2008 sedan parked near the Little Haiti Industrial Rail Yard. The luxury lifestyles they had boasted about on social media had evaporated completely, leaving them to experience the bitter reality of absolute poverty. When I stepped out onto the granite steps of the courthouse, flanked by my parents, Patricia and Ashley desperately lunged past the barrier line of news cameras, held back only by the court marshals as they wept hysterically, begging for mercy. Tears streaked their unwashed faces as Patricia sobbed that sleeping in a vehicle had opened her eyes to her wicked choices, while Ashley pleaded for just $200 so they could buy bus tickets back to rural Georgia. True freedom requires the courage to sever toxic familial bonds without a single grain of guilt. Walking away from people who sought to destroy you is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate realization of self-worth. Forgiveness does not mean opening your doors to predators or offering a lifeline to those who tried to drown you. It means releasing the anger from your heart so you can stop defining your life by their cruelty, replacing the urge for petty revenge with the quiet strength of self-preservation. I looked down at them calmly, feeling neither hatred nor satisfaction, only a profound sense of closure. I told them that I accepted their apology, but informed them that the road they were walking was paved entirely by their own choices, and that they would have to face the consequences of their destiny alone. I turned away, stepping into my father's luxury SUV as the security driver closed the door, permanently shutting them out of my world. Ultimate victory is never achieved merely by watching your enemies fall. The justice of punishment only clears away the weeds, but true fulfillment comes from becoming a builder who sows new seeds for the future. The highest form of triumph is using the power, resources, and clarity you have reclaimed to construct a lasting legacy that protects and uplifts others. In the weeks following the trial, I allocated $1 million of my reclaimed capital to establish the Anchor Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to offering legal defense, emergency shelter, and specialized medical support to victims of domestic financial and medical abuse. Standing beside my parents on the deck of our flagship vessel in the Miami harbor at sunset, I watched the golden light reflect across the water. I stood strong, unburdened, and completely in control of my empire, knowing that I had transformed a story of betrayal into a story of absolute strength. If this story inspired you to stand strong and cut toxic people out of your life, hit subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments below, and join our community today.